One of the first videos that I ever did on my channel was about Saint Juan Diego and how I think that his probable non-existence and non-historicity is a fairly large problem for the Catholic Church, one that is under-discussed. That video mentions Our Lady of Guadeloupe and it mentions the Tilma, but only in passing. Since Our Lady of Guadeloupe was probably the second most popular Marian apparition at my chapel growing up, and since in many parts of the Catholic world, Our Lady of Guadeloupe is the most popular Marian apparition, I think that a video by me addressing the Tilma of Juan Diego is overdue. In this video, I am going to be responding to some of the most common claims made about the Tilma of Saint Juan Diego. Before we jump into it, I would like to give a brief overview of what the Tilma is for those of you who maybe weren't raised quite like I was. According to Catholic tradition, there was a native Mexican man who lived in Mexico City in the early 1500s whose name was Juan Diego. Our Lady appeared to Juan Diego in December of 1531 and asked him to have a church built in her honor. So he went to the bishop to ask him to build that church. But the bishop asked for a sign that Mary really had appeared to Juan Diego. So he went back and he asked Our Lady for a sign. She made flowers grow right in front of him, and those flowers only bloom in the spring. So this was miraculous since it was December. So Juan Diego gathers up the flowers in his tilma, a garment worn by Mexican natives at that time, like a big flowy shirt, and he brings the flowers to the bishop. But when Juan Diego drops all the flowers at the feet of the bishop, which by itself could have been a sign, it is revealed that the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe had been miraculously imprinted on Juan Diego's tilma. The bishop is convinced, they built the church, and everyone lives happily ever after. My original video discusses why I don't think that we have enough evidence to even hold that Juan Diego is a real historical person. This video, though, is about the tilma, which we still have to this day. It's housed in the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico City. With that, let's examine the claims. We are going to be looking at 6 claims in this video, 4 of which come from one TikTok video. Claim number 1 is that the entire tilma was painted in a single brushstroke.
An infrared study from 1981 shows the image was made in one single brushstroke. That's physically impossible, especially for someone in the 16th century.
Before I address the claim that the tilma was painted in a single brushstroke, I need to point out that I definitely grew up learning that the tilma was not painted at all, not that it was painted in a single brushstroke. This is similar to the claims made about the Shroud of Turin, that it simply wasn't painted at all, not that it was painted in a single brushstroke. When I look online, I see mostly claims that it was painted in a single brushstroke, like the TikTok said, but the closest thing that I could find to what I'm talking about comes from the Magis Center, who said that, quote, the original image of the Virgin herself, however, does not appear to have been painted by an artist. There is no sketch underneath it, no brush strokes, no corrections. It appears to have been produced in a single step. But then the Magis Center does go on to admit that, quote, several parts of the cloth which have been painted on sometime after the original image was created. So I do think, though, that the original claim that it wasn't painted at all actually comes from the original story, which is found here on the web archive. Look in particular at verses 215 through 18. They came to acknowledge its divine character, and they came to offer her their prayers. They marveled at the miraculous way it had appeared, since absolutely no one on earth had painted her beloved image. But both of these claims are wrong. The very first time that the tilma pops up in history, it is being referred to as being painted. During a formal investigation of the cloth in 1556, it was stated that the image was, quote, painted yesteryear by an Indian, and another person says it was painted specifically by the Indian painter Marcos. Marcos is probably referring to Marcos Sipak, a well-known native Mexican painter who was active at that time. let's take a look at another painting by Marcos Sipak and see if it looks like the Tilma. I'll leave this one up to you and ask you if the person who you think painted this may have also painted the Tilma. But we don't need to stop with a historical investigation. In 2002, Prosecco published an interview with Jose Sol Rosales, formerly the director for the Center of the Conservation and Listing of Heritage Artifacts of the National Institute of Fine Arts in Mexico City, in which Rosales suggested that there was visible brushwork on the original image, but admittedly in a small area around her eyes, including the irises, which apparently have outlines. Rosales examined the cloth with a stereo microscope and observed that the canvas appeared to be a mixture of linen and hemp or cactus fiber. It had been prepared with a brush coat of white primer, calcium sulfate, and the image was then rendered in distemper, as in paint consisting of pigment, water, and a binding medium. The artist used a very limited palette consisting of black from pine soot, white, blue, green, and various earth colors, and reds and golds. Rosales concluded that the image did not originate supernaturally, but was instead the work of an artist who used the materials and methods of the 16th century. So whether or not Marcos painted it, it was painted in more than one brushstroke. The second claim that we'll look at today is the claim that there are reflections in the eyes of Our Lady on the Tilma.
When Mary's eyes are magnified 2,500 times, you can actually see the reflection of the people who were standing there at the time of the apparition. Also, the image is triple layered, which is what happens to the natural human eye. This phenomenon was not known about in the 1500s.
That TikTok's not the only place that I've heard this. I've heard this all over, but perhaps most notably, Catholic apologist Patrick Madrid will talk about this often as like a scientific proof for Catholicism.
I want to talk about the eyes of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Tilma. You can see reflections in her eyes.
The Knights of Columbus says that scientists have discovered that Mary's eye possess 3 effects of image refraction of a living eye. You would think that the claim that the scientists have discovered this would mean that an actual study was done, but I can't find a study published anywhere in a real journal or from a publication mill. I can find a book, though, more on that in a minute, but in fact, it looks like there weren't even any, scientists involved, according to still the Knights of Columbus. It was one guy, Dr. Jose Oste Tonsman. Dr. Tonsman is indeed a PhD from Cornell, no less, a PhD in civil engineering, meaning that he's an engineer like me, not a scientist. To be clear, Dr. Tonsman wasn't the first person nor the only person doing work on this topic. The Knights of Columbus doesn't mention this, but people have been doing work on the reflections in the eyes for quite some time now. First, in 1929, Alfonso Marcu, the Guadalupe Basilica photographer at that time, noticed what he thought of was the reflection of a man in the eye of Our Lady. Then in 1951, another photographer of the Tilma, Jose Carlos Salinas Chavez, made the same observation. Then in 1956, 2 ophthalmologists, Drs. Javier Torrella Bueno and Rafael Torrija Lavignette, looked at those pictures and concluded the same thing, that the eyes were exhibiting the Samson-Purkinje effect, where you can see the reflection of what Our Lady was seeing. Then, in 1979, Dr. Tonsman, the civil engineer from Cornell, took pictures with the best cameras that were around in 1979, and here is what he saw. Is this somewhat less impressive than you were hoping for? What if I showed you the image with a red outline to show you that bearded man? You can find a lot of other images online that have that man colored in as well as other people colored in to make it way more obvious, like this one from a research paper on the Tilma. And there's a ton of other images in the other eye that have colored in portions to show the other reflections in the eyes too. But for all the wild claims about the eyes, I find this all super underwhelming. I think that we're just coloring in ink blots and then calling it reflections. Dr. Tonsman wrote about his findings in a book, not a study, a book, called Los Ojos de la Virgen de Guadeloupe, published in 1981. I tried pretty hard to find a copy of that book online, but I couldn't find one. I did find an Amazon listing, though, for a used paperback copy of it for $122, and it's in Spanish. I want to read the original work, but not $122 bad, so my research into the eyes has to end here for now. Claim number 3. The tilma should have decomposed by now.
They have a cactus fiber that should have broken down in about 10 to 15 years. It's been 500 years since then, and it still hasn't disintegrated.
So you'll notice in the TikTok that they said that the tilma is made of cactus fiber. It's evidently not. There may be cactus fibers in it, but some sources say that it's made from linen and cactus fiber. Other sources say that it's made from agave fiber. It's kind of hard to tell. So that makes it hard to look into. But also just finding data about how long any of these materials should last has also been kind of difficult. I work in pharma, so I'm relatively familiar with the concept of stability. Drugs have expiration dates, right? And how do we find out those expiration dates? Well, essentially we do stability tests where we just kind of leave the drugs in stability chambers for a long time, and then at regular intervals, we test to see if those drugs still work. And once they stop working, we say, okay, it has to expire before this. To find stability data for agave fiber and for cactus fiber, and I couldn't really find anything substantial. I did find a fashion website called Fiber to Fashion that says that agave fiber is strong, highly durable, and has a high affinity for humidity. I did find this research paper that says that in the 1600s, some people left out of agave fiber cloths that were painted for 10 years, and those cloths suffered significant deterioration. But there's no citation at all for this study that was conducted in the 1600s. And so I'm not really sure what to make of it. I mean, that was 400 years ago, so I'm a little skeptical about this study. I'm fairly skeptical that we should expect the tilma to have disintegrated by now. I mean, consider all the garments that we have throughout history that are still fairly well preserved. The first thing that comes to mind is, the Shroud of Turin, which isn't decomposed yet. But some of my audience might think that both the tilma and the shroud are both like supernatural. So the fact that the shroud has lasted a long time doesn't mean that the tilma isn't supernatural. They could just be both supernatural. Also, they are made out of different materials. So let's consider some non-Christian garments that are also really old. The Tarkan dress is the name of a linen dress that was found in an ancient Egyptian cemetery. That dress was radiocarbon dated in 1978 to 2362 BC, but then more accurately carbon dated in 2015 to a range between 3102 BC to 3482 BC. That means that this dress is 5,000 years old, and this dress looks pretty good. So the tilma being 500 years old and also being at least in part made of linen, the same material that the Tarkan dress is made from, isn't nearly as impressive as the Tarkan dress, which is 5,000 years old. And yes, I know Egypt is arid and that's why stuff gets preserved there better. Mexico can be more humid, so there are differences, but the Tarkan dress is 10 times older than the tilma. Side note, we redid the radiocarbon dating on the Tarkan dress, but we've never redone the radiocarbon dating on the shroud. I wonder why. Regardless, we also have the Fort Rock sandals that were found in Rainy, Oregon that are supposedly 9,000 years old, and those are made from plant fibers too, just like the tilma. Then there's the flax fiber from Georgia, not the US Georgia, Eastern Europe Georgia, that are supposedly 34,000 years old. I could keep going, listing the oldest fiber clothing materials that we've found, but I just don't think it's that shocking that the tilma hasn't dissolved yet. And frankly, I'm not sure why Catholics tout this claim like it's some supernatural thing that the tilma is still intact. I can't find any reason to suspect that the tilma should have disintegrated by now. Claim number 4 is that the tilma converted 8 to 15 million Aztecs.
Due to the miracles of the image, anywhere from 8 to 15 million Aztecs converted to Catholicism. That's the biggest conversion in history.
So Mexico was indeed converted to Catholicism, and it remains overwhelmingly Catholic to this day. But I don't think that it was just the Tilma that converted all of the native Mexicans. Certainly the Tilma played a part, but I don't think that it's quite right to say that the Tilma converted all of these people. Hernan Cortez forced Catholicism on the native Mexican slaves that he took during his conquest of Mexico from 1519 to 1521. Obviously, Cortez couldn't have enslaved enough native Mexicans to convert the whole country with the army that he brought, but Cortez viewed conquest of Mexico as being incomplete without conversion of the natives to Catholicism. So he wrote to the King of Spain and asked for missionaries to be sent. The Franciscans arrived in Mexico in 1524, with the Jesuits and the Augustinians soon to follow. The apparitions occurred, according to the story, in 1531, after the Franciscans and the Jesuits and the Augustinians had arrived. And then, in 1569, the Holy Office of the Spanish Inquisition was actually set up in Mexico, and it became illegal for non-Catholics to move into Mexico. According to that 1981 study that we've mentioned earlier, a decent amount of the imagery of Our Lady on the Tilma was added in the second half of the 16th century, after the Inquisition had arrived in Mexico and mass conversions had already happened. So it seems more likely to me that the Tilma was painted as an image used in worship services for the cult at Tepeyac, the cult which worshipped both pagan gods and the Catholic gods like Mary. Then, after the mass conversion happened, the cult at Tepeyac kind of refashioned the Tilma into something a little bit more orthodoxly Catholic, and that's why we see the layers. The image was made more in line with Orthodox Catholic teaching as more and more people became Catholic. So while it's true to say that, 8 to 15 million native Mexicans converted to Catholicism, I'm not so certain that it's right to say that the Tilma converted all of these people. Claim number 5, there is music embedded within the Tilma. If you Google this one, you'll probably find links to YouTube videos playing the music that you're hearing right now. And it sounds pretty amazing, right? Heavenly, even? And listen to this, it's not just a melody, there is a harmony, and is that a cymbal that I just heard? Like from percussion? How did percussion come from the Tilma too? It didn't. Let's listen to the original, and we can watch the original being played as well. Watch the bar move across the stars on Our Lady's dress. Each star is a note, and so when multiple notes line up, we get a harmony. I mean, hey, that's still pretty crazy that we get a harmony, right? No. The game was rigged from the beginning. The person who put this together simply decided to restrict all possible notes to the key of C major. So there's only the 7 notes from C major that could be selected, and since any of the notes from C major sound good when you play them together, the fact that we're getting some kind of harmony is not at all surprising. When you restrict any random string of notes to all being from the same key, it's gonna sound like music. You've rigged it from the start to sound like music. You could do this with dice. You could just roll some dice, see where they land, arbitrarily assign notes to the results, and as long as you restrict yourself to assigning notes that are all in the same key, you can't really go wrong. It's going to sound like some kind of melody. But where did the different note lengths and where did the percussion come from? Remember in the original, every single note is just assigned a quarter note. It's the same. It's quarter notes all the way through. But in the arranged version, the notes have different lengths. Listen. And then the arranged one has an additional layer of harmony underneath the melody. If you actually notice, the harmony begins before the melody does. Where did all of this come from? The person who put this together just made it up. Like they took the simple sequence of notes from the original and then they arranged it. They added harmony to it. They added even light percussion on top of it. Even the subreddit Our Catholicism doesn't believe that this music is miraculous in any way. Take a look at this comment. So really, there's just kind of nothing here. This is mundane, and this could be done with literally any image or even just a random number generator. And lastly, we'll take a look at the claim that the tilma is a normal human body temperature at all times. Some people claim that the tilma is always 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see that on the blog West Coast Catholics. There's literally nothing to this claim, though. The Catholic News Agency interviewed Father Eduardo Chavez. Father Chavez is one of the most renowned experts on the Guadalupe apparitions, and he was the postulator of St. Juan Diego's cause for canonization. So this priest is very involved in the canonization of St. Juan Diego. He co-founded and is currently the dean of the Higher Institute for Guadalupan Studies. The Catholic News Agency said that Father Chavez, quote, dispelled a common rumor when he said that the tilma, quote, doesn't have a temperature like a human being would have. And one last fun fact, the tilma isn't the right size. This was actually pointed out to me by a comment on my first Juan Diego video, and I think it's worth pointing out here as well. I'm going to read this comment here. I haven't been able to find all of the sources from this comment that AJ Tony 1313 left, but it sounds like that's because a lot of these are in books that I don't own and that these aren't really on the internet. One amazing fact you've probably never been aware of is that the Juan Diego tilma hanging in the basilica is too large. The average height of a 16th century Aztec would be about 5'6". The tilma in the basilica would comfortably fit a man between 7 and 8 feet tall. This is not a claim or a rumor, but simple fact using simple math. AJ Tony 1313 goes on to say, I first noticed this anomaly on my own. I then diligently searched for any reference to this over the last 492 years. After much effort, I found to date only 3 vague references. A 1666 paper by the Mexican scholar Luis Becerra Tonco, stating that the tilma cloth had to have been the cape of a tall man. Second, in a 4-volume 1995 set of encyclopedias on Our Lady of Guadeloupe titled Encyclopedia Guadalupana, was the quote, the Virgin had to have been set sideways, the painting had to have been set sideways, thus recognizing that the image must have been horizontal to fit the tilma. Third reference to the size anomaly was by a lay person, John Rydell, working on a more recent project with school children to make a copy of the tilma. This reference is now blocked. You will not find this size anomaly if you search the internet. Very strange. All right, I better stop there. This video is pretty long as it is, but I think after all of this, our confidence that anything supernatural happened with the Our Lady of Guadeloupe story should be lessened. The questionable historicity of Juan Diego as a person, I think, should do a lot of lifting. But if my first video didn't convince you of anything, maybe this video did. Thanks for watching.